All right, this is our fifth lecture on the Great War, World War One. And so we're going to kind of end the war. That's the plan by the end of the video here. So what begins the beginning of the end? Really, what causes the end of Germany really begins with the Lusitania sinking of 1915. That puts the Americans on high alert, and they give the ultimatum of, hey, stay away from America, stay out of the shipping lanes, and that forces them again to have to bring back unrestricted submarine war, move away from unrestricted submarine warfare. That causes issue there. As we move into 1917, we talked about previously, the Germans are making that gamble. Now, to help kind of sweeten the deal on that gamble, to really make sure that the Americans are going to be able to stay out of the war, the um, or the foreign secretary in Britain, or sorry, in Germany, the foreign secretary in Berlin, right, creates a telegram that's encoded and sent to the German envoy in Mexico City to give to the Mexican government. The British were able to read these telegrams, intercept this in the end of January, and then they relay this information to the Americans. What the Zimmerman telegram tells the tells Mexico is that Germany is going to make an alliance with Mexico, and the Mexicans and the Germans are going to make war together and make peace together. Germany wants and was going to give money for Mexico to invade across the Rio Grande River into the southern United States in trying to help the Mexicans gain back territory lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War, all the way up to San Francisco, right, along the California border and all the other stuff in there. Right? There's hints in the Zimmerman telegram of also putting out feelers to the Japanese, so kind of with a combined Japanese-Mexican invasion of the United States supported financially by Germany. As you probably can imagine, this becomes a direct threat to America. The United States now has in its possession, Woodrow Wilson, the president, is looking at a telegram that's saying that Germany is going to do this, on top of the telegram also saying that unrestricted submarine warfare will begin in early February. And this becomes the last straw for the Americans, and that's what's going to bring them into the war. In terms of the Eastern Front in 1917, Germany is going to leash a new secret weapon into Russia. And that secret weapon is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, as we'll talk about in previous, in upcoming lessons, is again one of the world's leading communists and one of the world's leading people to take Marxian idea of communism and try to bring out a world revolution. And he's been kind of kicked out of Russia at this point, and he's all this stuff. And he is sitting in the neutral country of Switzerland, which is allowed in there, in a Swiss chalet, drinking his Swiss Miss hot chocolate, crying his eyeballs out in 1914 and 1915 and 1916 because he feels like this is his moment on the world stage and he's stuck in the kind of Alpian paradise that is Switzerland. Stuck there and he's all upset about it. Germans send spies. They meet up with Lenin and they convince him, we want you to be dropped into Russia, where his home country where he wants to be, and they want him to help spread the bacillus, the virus that is communism, into Russia. And he hardly agrees. The Germans are so scared of Lenin and communism inside of Germany that they actually put him on a sealed train that has all the shades kind of drawn. The train is not allowed to make any stops as it travels from Switzerland through Germany into Russia before finally dropping him off in there. And Lenin then unleashes the communist revolution over there. And again, we'll dive into this in later lectures in deeper detail. The communists are going to eventually overthrow the Tsar, and a civil war is going to break out in Russia between the communists on one side and those supporting the Russian government on the other side. Lenin and the communists, to kind of gain the initiative, are looking at this and saying our ultimate goal is a worldwide workers' revolution. And that goal is going to be kind of moved towards by taking over Russia. That's our first goal, is to gain a foothold in Russia. This side conflict with Germany is not part of our goal. So Lenin sits down with the Germans and signs with them the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And there, one quarter of the vast country of Russia is signed over to the Germans. Russia now is out of the war, and Lenin is not too concerned about this. Lenin says, let it go. It's lines on a map, and Lenin will take over Russia, consolidate power, and then work to overthrow capitalism. So none of these lines matter in the short term because it's all about, again, maximizing opportunities from there. So by the beginning of 1918, Russia is now out of the war, and the Germans are able to send all of the vast divisions that they have fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front over into the Western Front to counteract that. So with the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Russians are out of the war, but with the Zimmerman telegram, the United States begins to move in there. And what the Germans begin to do as they reshuffle their army towards the end of 1917, as all this stuff is breaking out on the Eastern Front, begins to amass a major giant offensive. They no longer have to deal with the Russians to the east, and they're going to drive the Americans back. The Americans, by the end of 1917, really only have a small army uh, in France. They're really hoping to be able to put, and they're promising 1 million men by the end of 1918 in there. But again, it's going to take a while to do that. And the Germans are hoping to be able to do there. So General John J. Blackjack Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, is going to begin landing in 1917. In later 1917, and begin kind of putting the first Americans there as they build and train an army back in the United States. The Germans in the beginning, sorry, the end of March of 1918 launched Operation Michael, right? Their major final push, right, to be able to overtake from this. And this major push with all the uh, kind of stormtrooper and trench kind of attacking systems that they've kind of worked on and perfected are thrown in there. And the Germans really accomplished something that we haven't seen in the Western Front since the beginning of the war. And they really forced the all along the Western Front a full-fledged retreat by the Allied forces. I mean, the Germans begin to move towards the suburbs of Paris. That's how far back the lines are moving. However, as the Germans are kind of pushing, what did they find? They found literal mountains of Hershey bars. They find that the British are eating real meat and real cheese in tins, and the effects of the German blockade back in the British blockade of Germany, right? These Germans have been eating bread made out of sawdust. They've been eating meat that's being squished out of a toothpaste tube. So they begin to find and see these gigantic supplies and stores, and there's stories of Germans, I mean soldiers just stopping and eating all this stuff here. And as they begin to push and push and push them there, and again with help with the Americans and other people, they're able to kind of it just kind of peters out. And once the Germans see that they can't take Paris, they can't push them out, they kind of the will that the air comes out of their sails, right? So the air is released from the balloon, and then it's just a full-fledged retreat backwards. And they're retreating so far back and so quickly back towards Germany that the German leadership really doesn't know what to do. By the end of October, the Kaiser abdicates the throne. He leaves and he goes and he runs away to uh, colonies to protect himself. The German high command, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, realize the jig is up. They don't want to be capturing this from there. They resign. They give power up to there. And as the Allies are pushing into Germany, the armistice occurs on November 11th, 1918. An armistice is a cessation of fighting. So it's an end of fighting. This is not peace. There's just an agreement that the soldiers are going to stop shooting at each other, that they're going to stop where they are, and they're going to discuss peace terms. And this occurs famously on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 11 a.m., November 11th of 1918. And I mean, this is a real strict, I mean, line in the sand type stuff. People are fighting and dying, and soldiers die up until November 11th at 10:59 and 58 seconds. People are dying, and then the guns stop and all, and the guns fall quiet on the Western Front from there. It's going to take another 6 months for the terms of the peace treaty, which we'll talk about for the course of this this lecture today. On June 28th of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is finally kind of set from there, and that ends kind of the war there. So again, the Lusitania is going to be a major thing that's going to bring the Americans into the war, and there's a whole lot of stuff that again we got to kind of move through this to help end the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans unleash again the plague, the virus that is communism, through the likes of their secret weapon of Vladimir Lenin, which knocks him out of the war, and then again that helps up set up the stage for the end of the war here. And again, um, what we can see is this is an audio recording, and so this graphically is going to show you, and you can see all the different lines and the blips and the other stuff as we're fighting all the way up to 10:59 and 11 a.m. You can see how that all goes and becomes quiet. Now, thanks to modern technologies, this is released a couple years ago for the kind of anniversary of this. And this, if you listen carefully, this is kind of electronically taking that record and putting that into sound. So hopefully, you'll be able to hear these guns. So those are all the guns that are going off. So you want to listen to hear all this is going, and then you'll eventually find out. So that's the gun falling silent there on the Western Front. We take a look back here. What's the scale of the war here? Germany's going to suffer the most. 67 million is the population that it has there. 111 million of the population is mobilized to go to war, and 1.8 are dead. I mean, this is not wounded. These are people aren't coming back. That represents 2.7% of its population. In terms of the French have 36.5 million people in its population. They mobilized 8.4 million soldiers. 1.4 million die, which represents 3.8% of the population. And again, the United States has 93 million people in it. They have 4.3 mobilized. They have 115,000 soldiers, which is 0.1%. So that's kind of why the First World War plays a lot bigger role in Europe than it does in the United States. But again, you have to remember that this is representing a very specific subset of the population of fighting age soldiers from, say, 18 to, say, like 35. And that's an entire generation of 1.8 million of them in Germany gone, 1.4 million of them gone in France. So think about all the girlfriends and wives and all of the girls who are going to grow up and find that there's simply not enough guys to go around to start their family that they're dreaming of having, right? So you can get again kind of see in kind of in proportions are some different numbers here of the countries that are suffering the most from there to the ones that are barely in the war long enough. And what we see represented a lot is again the battlefields of World War One, whether it's just giant pits of skulls and bodies and remains, or the kind of these immaculately kept um, cemeteries where soldiers are kind of marked where they fall. It's the kind of marks the lead up and the advancements of the Somme. And some of these battles you can track and see how they go from there. And all these are again from there. And so um, again, you have ones where you have individual soldiers are getting age 19 with their own epitaphs on there, and then this is a soldier of the Great War, along with 10 soldiers as well that are in there. Some of these memorials, there's nothing of these guys that remain, and so they're just become names on a wall. Um, that from there, some of the soldiers who are fighting up in the Alps between the Italians and Austro-Hungarians are fighting again in glaciers and other stuff. And so with the effects of like global warming and things as stuff begins to melt, um, you can see these are two soldiers who died and then were fused together in the ice, and now they're coming to light. And you can still be pretty profitable. Kind of as a battlefield souvenir, like going through some of these places and picking out pocket watches, and they have what's called the Iron Harvest every year in France and in Belgium. People are still dying and are being injured from shells from the First World War that are inching their way up, that were kind of sucked up in the mud and inching their way towards the surface. farmers are hitting these, detonating these with their plows, and are getting hurt. And there's entire, I mean, plants in France and in Belgium where a farmer has to call out a bomb, I think of it as a bomb squad to be able to take a shell that could change between oxygen gas or high explosives and have it go from there. And there's some places that are so littered with these shells that they won't even let people in there. It's okay if a sheep blows up, but they don't want a person to blow up. We just came out of kind of the centenary celebrations through most of the stuff. In London, they had a pretty striking one where these are ceramic poppies that are kind of spilling out of the tower in London, and each one of these little flowers represents a British imperial soldier lost during the war, so you can kind of just get a sense of scale for some of the stuff from there. Again, just to roll off some of the numbers, casualties, one half of all the soldiers mobilized were killed and or wounded. So if you signed up to be a soldier in World War One, it was a 50-50 chance. It's a coin flip, whether you got out of the war unscathed or you were killed or shot in one way. There's over 18 million wounded survivors. Again, we talk about this affecting a very specific subset of the population. It's estimated that one out of every two Frenchmen between the ages of 20 or 30 was killed in France from this. One half of all survivors are estimated to have psychological damage, and that's probably going to be rounded a lot higher up as we learn more about kind of the mental effects of going to war. One half of all the corpses of these soldiers are never found. We talked about missing often meant obliterated into nothing. There's over 8.5 million prisoners taken during the war. That represents 10% of the entire total mobilization of the countries around the world. So again, the one in the with the coin flip, whether you're going to be killed or wounded during the war, you have a 1 in 10 chance of being captured during the war. And a key takeaway as we move and see and look from this is that the scarred, mutilated, and or crippled veteran is going to be a common sight across European towns and cities for a generation. The earliest forms of plastic surgery and reconstructive surgery are going to be kind of tinkered with and worked out here on these soldiers of the First World War to kind of give them some sort of quality of life or make them not horrify little kids as they're walking from there. 3 years after the end of World War One, in Britain, 65,000 men were still receiving disability pensions because of shell shock. And again, you think of like post-traumatic stress disorder. These were 65,000 former soldiers in at this point 1921 who still need a assistance from the government because they cannot go to war. They cannot go to work because of the effect from the war. So again, this like 1,000 yard stare of the shell shock soldier becomes kind of an iconic thing that comes out of the First World War. The soldiers are going to try to make that from there. Again, there's all sorts of horrific injuries you could have from the new stuff on the battlefield. This guy's playing pool on kind of artificial legs. This guy doesn't have a lower half of his body. And then again, you can see this is some of the masks that were being kind of worked on and some of the face masks. And you could kind of see in not the greatest picture some of the injuries and other stuff some of these people suffered and how doctors tried to work and reconstruct them. Again, there's some graphic pictures coming up here in a second, but you can kind of see that this soldier is getting fitted with a face mask to be able to kind of hold um, and stuff from there. This soldier had his nose shut off, and then he's got a kind of a face plate that kind of clips over the top so that he gets a little bit normal. Again, you have other things for that particular soldier, and then again, some reconstructive surgery to kind of help fix all that stuff. And again, these are all worked on in Britain and France a lot after the war. So as we move here, it's important when the war is over. Look at this. It's spinning, it's moving. Look at this. We'll do it again here. This is important to understand is one, when Germany surrenders, there's not a single foreign soldier on German soil. Germany controls 1/4 of the former Russian Empire. There are German troops still in France and still in Belgium. The German people themselves, finding out, are quite literally shocked to find that the government is quitting and that they no longer have a Kaiser in charge, and that they're changing governments because of wartime censorship and propaganda had controlled information to such an extent in Germany. They were expecting to be knocking on the Paris's doorstep any second now, and they're totally flummoxed by the idea of this. And this, what we'll talk more about with Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazis that's going to come out of this, is the famous stab in the back legend begins to grow kind of as this conspiracy theory in Germany. That the brave German soldiers were just about to win the war. They were in the gardens of Versailles. They were just about to capture Paris when greedy German governments and fat cat industrialists and German bankers stabbed the German soldier in the back, figuratively took away their ability financially and militarily to continue on the fight. And so the Germans are going to believe in this idea. Again, that's not so much true, but again, the idea, the belief is important that they had victory it, snatched from them. The the victory was snatched from the jaws of the feet, right, right from there, and so they're unhappy about it. And so, particularly the Jews are going to be blamed for this, but also socialists and politicians are sabotage this certain German victory that they're going to be very upset about from there. So, what ends officially the war is going to be the Treaty of Versailles. As the sides are coming together following the armistice. The two sides are beginning working out. The Germans don't trust the French. They know the French, rightfully so, are going to be very harsh and very vindictive towards the Germans. So the Germans asked for a peace according to President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point proposal of January of 1918. That's where he provided 14 points, which you'll learn about in your homework and some other activities we'll do in class that kind of spelled out what the United States would fighting for, and how Wilson wants to have those terms dictated. So, what the Allies are going to demand of Germany is that one, Britain just says Germany gives up some territory, but Britain wants to re-establish Germany as quick as they can to help them rebuild so they can start trading with their largest continental trading power right away. The United States and President Woodrow Wilson wants his 14-point peace proposal from Germany, and he especially wants his League of Nations. We'll talk about that more in a second. Italy wants parts of Austria-Hungary and Germany's African colonies. Italy switched over to the Allied side about halfway through the war. And what France wants dollar bills. They want reparations. They want cold hard cash. They want to cripple the German ability to have of war, to cripple the German war capacity, not just for 10 years or 15 years, but for generations. For the French, the Germans have been in France, right, in the Franco-Prussian War, in World War One, right, going back even farther than that. The French have been invaded twice by Germany in the last 50 years. They want to make it so that Germany can never, ever attack the French again. And so they want to be able to carve out enough money and treasure from them so that Germany is so busy rebuilding for generations to come that France is going to be able to, one, protect itself, and two, not have to worry about it. So Wilson can't really do a whole lot from the United States, and so he goes to Paris. It's one of the first times a sitting U.S. president leaves the country to go, particularly to Europe or others, because he believes he can appeal directly to the masses in Europe and compel them to make their leaders follow their example with a public opinion. And the people in Paris and Europe welcome him with major demonstrations and really like this idea. However, in Paris, different priorities are going to clash. Wilson wants to use the peace, wants to use the Treaty of Versailles to enshrine a democratic peace with the ideas of self-determination, the idea that each nationalist, each ethnic, each cultural group can self-determine through elections and through other peaceful ways that if they want to be their own country or if they want to still remain a part of older imperial or empire stuff. And he wants to create a League of Nations, right? A kind of international coalition of uh, diplomats from all the nations of the world where they can talk their differences out instead of resorting to war. The Europeans, the British, the French, the Italians are going to emphasize at Versailles the imperatives of security. They want to make sure that Germany can't attack them anymore, and also the realities of what's going on, playing this idea of tough power politics, the idea of let's kick Germany while they're down, while we have the opportunity to do so. So Woodrow Wilson is famously going to sail across the Atlantic, right, in 1919, and he's going to go and he's going to be met by, again, lots of fanfare. Vive Wilson. There's streets and named after him. He's got all this stuff because people are happy that he's bringing these peace proposals along with them. The Germans at Versailles are left out of the negotiations. Their delegates are locked into a room, so they basically can't present their case, and they have to wait and see what the terms are decided from there. The Allies, there's a whole bunch of different nations that are there, but it basically boils down to what were called the Big Four negotiators. From the United States, we have President Woodrow Wilson. From Great Britain, you have the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, is the leader of the government in Britain. In France, you have the Premier, George Clemenceau. And Italy sends the Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando. So Wilson, David Lloyd George, George Clemenceau, and Vittorio Orlando are kind of the big four. They're big head honchos, along with all of the other smaller government underlings, are the ones who are really deciding the terms of the peace proposal. Japan is also included in some of the discussions, and so in some cases it becomes the big five, but those are the big four that are kind of up there. Another key thing to keep in the back of your head is that time is a crucial factor in these negotiations. The Allies are demobilizing. There's Americans in Paris who want to go home. They got Daisy's had puppies on the farm in Iowa. They want to go back there. People want to go. The people want to go home. They don't want to be in the army anymore. So the armies are demobilizing. There's revolutions happening in Poland, in the newly formed Czech Republic, in Russia, there, and talk about in our last lecture, there's an entire killer flu, which is also throwing a whole bunch of stuff in there. So that's kind of the stuff that's going in. Germany's kind of in play that they can just keep attacking, but again, this time's there. So who are our guys? We have Woodrow Wilson right here. This is George Clemenceau. You know him with his big mustache. That's Victoria Orlando, and that's the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. So those are the big four negotiators at the Treaty of Versailles. These are the German diplomats who are pretty much again locked into this room, and they're the ones who basically are going to be forced with again with the idea that there's going to be an invasion of Germany if they don't go along with this. What we can take and we'll talk about in our World War II chapter is that these guys, by signing this peace treaty, are going to be signing their own deaths, their death certificates. They're going to be signing their lives away because the people in Germany, as we'll see, are going to be so upset with this that this is going to kind of be one of the last things they're going to do on the world stage. By the 1920s, all of the six diplomats will be shot dead through assassinations because people are so upset about this. Where does this take place? It takes place, again, in one of the most famous rooms in all of world history, the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris in France. And so, again, the same room where the German Empire was created in 1871 is now going to be the room where Germany is going to be forced to be able to do that. And as you can probably tell, the major thing is people are stepping on. Again, these are all priceless, like works of art and furniture that these soldiers and diplomats are standing on, and they'll be able to get a look inside of this. So when all the nations do this and the ink is dry, what are some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles? What does the Treaty of Versailles say? One, you're going to have to remember this for your quiz. This is important, is that this is the most specific thing we're going to ask you through the entire year, is that Clause 231 of the Treaty of Versailles says, and again, very important, it's in capital letters here, Germany has to accept blame for starting the war. So the Versailles Treaty puts it in black and white, in plain English, that Germany is going to, in the world opinion, they're the ones who started the war. They're the ones who have to accept blame for doing so. And this is going to be a major point of contention that Germans, particularly Hitler, are going to bring up again and again and again from this. So this is a big deal. Germany is also going to lose territory. It's going to be stripped of all its colonies. 13% of its pre-war territory is going to be given away to new nations, and over 10% of its population is going to be stripped from it. Germany's armed forces are reduced. Germany is only allowed, when the treaty terms are put into place, a maximum of 100,000, and this is a key volunteer army. They can't draft anybody, it has to be all volunteers. They are not allowed to have any planes. They're not allowed to have a single air force. They're stripped of all their submarines as well. The area called the Rhineland is demilitarized, and this is kind of a 30-mile wide belt from the Rhine River to kind of the Ruhr River, the major industrial center of Germany. But this is importantly its western border with France, and so the Germans are not allowed to have a single offensive military weapon or defensive weapon in this 30-mile belt, with the idea being that the French now have a 30-mile buffer zone. If the Germans are going to invade France, they've got to get through this 30-mile belt first. Germany is also forced to pay reparations for the damages it's caused. this number goes through a lot of different negotiations and otherwise, and finally in 1921, that is set at 32 billion dollars. So it's 32 billion with a B. The payment plan that's worked out in 1921 is that Germany would still be paying reparations for World War One if you take away anything else happening in the 20th century, all the way up until the 1990s. That is how big of an adjustment this is. And again, that number will change as we get into the next chapter and other stuff. And then also industrial and commercial limitations are put upon Germany. So these are the major terms of what the Treaty of Versailles says, particularly dealing with Germany. So it's real long. It's very detailed, and you can kind of go from there. And it is itself technically five different separate treaties with all the different defeated powers. Austria is forced to give up territory, and Austria, who's barely hanging on at this point and just desperately wants to join up with Germany, the native German speakers, they're not allowed to, which kind of trying to keep Germany from being too powerful. Hungary becomes its own country and is forced to give up lands to new Slavic states, Yugoslavia, the Czech Republic. Bulgaria is forced to give up territory. The Ottoman Empire sees itself being broken up. A young army soldier who leads the defense of Gallipoli from the British invasion, Ahmed Ataturk, is going to lead a kind of um, a government takeover in the Ottomans, and that's going to fall apart. And so, because the Ottoman Empire falls apart and the people in Turkey kind of coalesce under the new country of Turkey, the major European powers slide in to try to take up territory from there. Syria and Lebanon are placed under French influence. Uh, the area called Palestine and Iraq. Iraq's taken because the British are influenced in the oil, particularly because of Winston Churchill putting these the Navy on switching them from coal to thing, and the British with the Balfour Declaration, which is we could spend an entire um, lecturing in on this out, are going to promise the creation for a Jewish state in here. And again, that's going to get real murky, and they're still working the details out here in 2020. And the Kurds and Armenians are looking to gain autonomy to form their own Kurdistan and their own Armenia, but Turkey is going to refuse. Out of this Turkish refusal, it'll lead to there's an event that goes on in World War One called the Armenian Genocide, where the Turks are going to brutally kill 1/2 to a million Armenians, all right, within this. And this is, again, a really contentious political issue. It's only very recently that the Pope even mentioned the word Armenian genocide, and that the U.S. government is kind of still really wishy-washy on using the word genocide out there. But basically, the Turks killed all these Armenians from this, and the Turks and the people in Turkey are very adamant that this didn't happen. That's a fabrication, but it's hard to fabricate having a million people in 1914 and not having a million people in 1918. That's again a really contentious political issue. I've seen this map before, so this is the map of Europe prior to World War One, and let's see how it changes from there. So the key thing we want to see is that Russia is stripped of all this territory, and you see all these new countries pop up. We talk about the Easter Rebellion, the creation of a new Republic of Ireland for a later date, but hopefully you can see as we go up, we're going the wrong way, go back and forth, how Germany is going to change, Austria-Hungary is going to be broken up, and you can see how Russia is going to be broken up as well. So again, so we move back and forth, the big change that happens over the course of the war. Germany itself is going to lose the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. That's given back to the French, and this has been going back and forth between these two countries for forever. It's going to lose territory to a newly created Poland, and it's going to create what's called the Danzig corridor to give Poland access to the sea. The free city of Danzig, the port in the Baltic, is opened up, and that's going to separate East Prussia away from Germany. And for people like Adolf Hitler, that little sliver of land is going to be a big thorn in the side of the Germans there. For in terms of the Armenian genocide, the Turks kind of rounded these people up and just marched them in some places away from their possessions in there. They starved them pretty brutally. That's the Turkish official kind of uh, showing from these starving kids from there, and people just die in the street, and it's a pretty brutal thing. And again, they're solely picked on for their religion and their ethnicity out of that. Another thing that comes out of the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, and what you want to understand that this is President Wilson's baby. This is the one thing he wants. Wilson has those 14 things. They said this is what the piece is going to be, but he really only cares about number 14, the League of Nations. He's willing to compromise and does on everything else in order to be able to get his league. And very quickly, the other negotiators pick up on this, and so they're able to kind of move and wiggle and waggle back and forth just so that they can get their way and that Wilson gets his precious league. What this is, we've talked about this before, is that the aim of the League of Nations is to promote peaceful resolutions of conflicts. There's going to be a general assembly and a smaller council that it's going to be a similar setup to the United Nations, but the United Nations is actually going to be able to do important things, and the League of Nations has no kind of repercussions other than sanctions and other stuff from there. The Treaty of Versailles has a lot of mixed reactions from this. New countries are created for formerly oppressed minorities, and so they're really pumped about this. Polish people in the newly created country of Poland are psyched for being a country for the first time since the Middle Ages, and so they're happy about that. The people, Czechs in the Czech Republic are going to, or in Czechoslovakia are going to be happy. The Slavs in Yugoslavia are going to be happy about that. So we have the Irish are going to be happy. So we have some national. However, colonial demands for independence are going to be mostly ignored. India, as we saw, sent 1.5, a million point five soldiers to the Western Front. They politely asked, "Hey, we helped you out here in Britain. Can we be this?" And particularly by people like Winston Churchill, they're going to be strongly shut down, and their demands for independence are going to be ignored pretty ruthlessly. Again, people like in Cambodia and Vietnam are going to also ask for this, and they're going to be ignored. A particular person asking for Vietnamese independence from kind of the harsh French control from there is going to be a young Ho Chi Minh who's going to save up all of his pennies and dimes to be able to sail as the World War is raging to London, gets a job from there, and then is able to kind of get himself to France as the war is ending, gets himself, smuggles himself into the hotel where the Big Four are negotiating, and gets himself in front of the Big Four negotiators to demand an independence for his home country of Vietnam. And he's laughed out of the room. And this is going to kind of be something that he's going to bring with them. And so, again, if you talk about the conflict of Vietnam, we can end it right here. Um, Here in 1919. The Japanese call for racial equality at the League of Nations, and the treaty is ignored and denied, and they are going to be pretty upset about that. A lot of economists are going to be extraordinarily skeptical about the German ability to be able to pay off these reparations. John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist, there's a whole school of economy called Keynesian economics, says that there's no possible way this is the worst thing you could possibly do for that. And importantly, Germany, Italy, Russia, Japan all feel cheated and betrayed. They're upset about this. They want their things. They didn't get it. And so, particularly Japan, looking from how did they feel? They feel kind of burdened by this overbearing Russian bear. They feel that the Chinese are backwards. And from there, and again, you have all this other stuff. So the Japanese don't get what they want from the other stuff. So when we step back to finish up for today with this slide here, what does the world look like at the end of World War One? We've gone through 4 years of brutal fighting. What is the end result? One, Russia's upset. Russia's upset because they are not involved in the peace treaty at all. They have territory, a quarter of it stripped from what they feel is Russian. There's a civil war raging in the country, and the communists are raging a kind of a brutal takeover of the economy and social, political, and cultural life of Russia. Britain and France find themselves financially, physically, and psychologically exhausted. And they're going to carry this exhaustion through the 1920s and 1930s for the most part. They can't see, and then they want to try to create a world where they don't have to have a huge proportion of their lives turned upside down by this fighting. The United States is not in the war long enough to enact a lot of the major changes Wilson wants at home and internationally. Isolationists back in the United States Senate are going to fight the Treaty of Versailles to the point where the United States actually does not sign the treaty. And so the United States does not join the League of Nations. And the United States has to, in the early 1920s, negotiate a completely different, separate peace treaty with Germany in order to end hostilities there. Germany itself finds itself at 1919 into 1920, torn apart by communist demonstrations linking in over from Russia, financially ruined and disillusioned. and they are looking for someone to restore the glory believed to have been stolen from them from that final offensive in 1918. And that person they're going to look to is this mustachioed soldier here on the right. Adolf Hitler, armistice, when he finds out the armistice is end, he's in a German army hospital. He's crying his little Hitler eyes out because he can't fathom this. And he's already, the seeds are being planted of how he's going to kind of rebuild the German image in the world, put Germany in its rightful place, and kind of go and make Germany rise again. But that is a story for another day.